My name is Marin, I am 31 years old, and after serving 12 grueling months as an army captain stationed at a forward operating base where the dust of the desert gets into your very soul, I learned that the most dangerous combat zones aren't always overseas. Sometimes the real landmines are buried under the plush, cream-colored wool carpets of the Summit Brook Country Club in Greenwich, Connecticut. I had been back on American soil for exactly 48 hours, still feeling the phantom weight of my interceptor body armor on my shoulders, when I found myself standing under 25-foot vaulted ceilings decorated with gold leaf and Italian crystal chandeliers. I thought I knew what stress felt like, but nothing in my military training prepared me for the moment my older sister, Delaney, decided to execute a public character assassination in front of 40 of the most influential people in the state. Delaney is 34, a professional socialite whose primary contribution to society is maintaining a curated Instagram feed and managing her husband's hedge fund connections. She was vibrating with a manic, terrifying energy, draped in a custom-made $4,500 Vera Wang gown that shimmered like a snake's skin under the LED recessed lighting. She didn't offer me a hug or ask how my deployment was. Instead, she marched across the ballroom, her 6-inch Jimmy Choo heels clicking like a firing pin against the polished marble floor. The room, which smelled of expensive lilies and $120 bottles of Veuve Clicquot being poured into chilled flutes, went deathly quiet. She didn't just look at me, she dissected me. Oh my God, is that cubic zirconia? What is this gas station jewelry? Delaney's voice didn't just rise. It shrieked, bouncing off the hand-painted crown molding and echoing back with a sharp metallic edge. Before I could even process the insult, she lunged forward, grabbing my left hand with a grip so tight her manicured French tips dug into my skin. She held my wrist up to the light like she was inspecting a piece of diseased meat or a fragment of trash she'd found on the bottom of her shoe. I felt the heat crawl up my neck, a deep, burning crimson that clashed with the formal attire I'd struggled to change into after months in camouflage. This ring was the only thing that kept me grounded while I was sleeping in a tent and listening to the low hum of generators and distant mortars. It was a modest, beautiful piece given to me by the man I love, but in the sterile, hyper-expensive vacuum of Delaney's world, it was an eyesore. I could see the guests, people I'd known since childhood, men in $3,000 Brioni suits and women dripping in Cartier, exchange knowing, cruel glances. A soft snicker broke out near the mahogany bar, followed by a wave of muffled laughter that felt like a physical assault. "You cannot wear this in my photos," Delaney hissed, her face inches from mine, smelling of expensive peppermint and overpriced Chardonnay. Her eyes were cold, piercing blue orbs devoid of any sisterly affection. "Take it off." No. She wasn't asking. She was issuing an order to someone she considered a subordinate in the hierarchy of her perfect life. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You see, Delaney has always been the golden child of the family, the one whose tantrums were rewarded with luxury SUVs and European vacations, while I was the one who was told to suck it up and be grateful for the scraps. As I stood there, surrounded by the opulence of the Summit Brook Country Club, the silence of the room felt more suffocating than any sandstorm I'd ever endured. I looked down at my hand at the ring she called gas station jewelry, and I realized that while I had been fighting a war abroad, my sister had been perfecting her own brand of domestic terrorism. The contrast was staggering, her $4,000 dress against my weathered skin, her pampered existence against the 12 months of hell I'd just survived. It was the ultimate injustice, a homecoming that felt more like a sentencing, and as she squeezed my wrist harder, I knew that the peace I had been searching for upon my return was nothing more than a mirage in the desert. My sister wanted a perfect picture and she was willing to break my spirit to get the lighting just right. The pressure of Delaney's grip on my wrist felt like a vice, her manicured nails digging into the skin I had spent a year protecting under tactical gloves and desert sun. It was sickening to stand there in the center of the Summit Brook Country Club, realizing that while I was clearing IEDs and managing a company of soldiers, my sister was perfecting the art of being a professional parasite. Delaney lives in a 3,000-square-foot penthouse in Arlington, Virginia, a glass-walled monument to vanity overlooking the Potomac River that costs her $6,800 a month in rent alone. She calls it her consulting headquarters, but everyone in the family knows those consulting fees are just glorified allowances from our parents and her husband's high-frequency trading firm. She hasn't worked a real 40-hour week in her entire 34 years of existence, yet here she was, acting as the ultimate authority on value and hard work. My life, by contrast, is contained within an 800-square-foot apartment near the base. A space filled with the smell of boot polish and CLP gun oil, where the rent is a fraction of her shoe budget and the furniture is mostly functional IKEA pieces designed to be moved at a moment's notice. She sneered at my hand again, her lip curling in a way that made her look more like a predator than a sibling. This gas station jewelry, as she so eloquently put it, was actually an IGI-certified, 1.8-carat lab-grown diamond set in a 14-carat white gold band. I didn't wait for a man to buy it for me, and I certainly didn't put it on a credit card I expected someone else to pay off. I bought it for $3,200 out of my own savings to celebrate my promotion to captain. To me, that sparkle represented every 0400 wake-up call in the freezing rain, every grueling 40-mile ruck march through the North Carolina brush, and every cent of the hazard pay I earned while living out of a duffel bag. It was a physical manifestation of my autonomy and my service. A quiet reminder that I survived the sand and the isolation of a 12-month deployment. But to Delaney, who sees the world through the distorted lens of a social media filter, the ring wasn't a symbol of achievement. It was just a prop she could use to make herself look wealthier by comparison. She wanted me to be the dowdy, pitiable soldier sister, the one who couldn't afford the real thing, so that her own $20,000 Harry Winston could shine even brighter. I could see the reflection of the crystal chandeliers in the facets of my stone, and I knew it was flawless, yet she continued to loud-talk me for the benefit of the audience. The guests were leaning in now, their expensive perfumes and colognes mixing into a cloying, suffocating fog as they waited for me to crumble under her scrutiny. Delaney leaned closer, her voice dropping to a jagged whisper that carried further than a shout. "You're embarrassing the family, Maren," she hissed, her eyes darting to a group of women in the corner who were already pulling out their iPhones to capture the drama. "We have a reputation in Greenwich, and I won't have my photos ruined by your cheap pride." I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the hollowness behind the Vera Wang gown. She didn't see a sister who had just returned from a war zone. She saw a blemish on her aesthetic. Every moment of my sacrifice, every night I spent staring at a grainy photo of home while the wind rattled the plywood walls of my quarters, was being dismissed because my diamond wasn't mined from the earth in a way that met her arbitrary standards of elitism. It was the ultimate betrayal of blood, a calculated move to keep me in the shadow she had built for me since we were children. She wanted me to feel small, but as I stood there in my dress blues, the weight of my accomplishments felt heavier and more permanent than any overpriced rock she could ever hope to flaunt. The betrayal reached its peak during the bridesmaid photoshoot, an event orchestrated with the surgical precision of a military operation but lacking any of the honor or camaraderie I had grown used to in the service. We were positioned on the sweeping stone veranda of the Summit Brook Country Club, the late afternoon sun casting long golden shadows across the manicured 18th green while two photographers, who Delaney boasted cost $200 an hour, adjusted their high-end Canon lenses to capture every artificial smile. Delaney stood in the center of the frame, a white-clad sun around which we were all forced to orbit, and she couldn't resist one final public execution of my dignity. She leaned toward me, her hand brushing against my sleeve as if she were fixing a stray thread, but her voice was pitched perfectly to carry across the terrace and reach the ears of the hired staff. "It is okay, Maren, we all know the Army does not pay for real diamonds, so there is no need to be embarrassed about wearing a fake in front of our guests," she said with a saccharine pout that didn't reach her cold, calculating eyes. The other bridesmaids, a collection of Delaney's sorority sisters and social climbers draped in $400 floor-length silk gowns in a shade of dusty rose, began to giggle behind their bouquets of white peonies and eucalyptus. The sound was high-pitched and sharp like the breaking of glass, and it cut deeper than any shrapnel ever could. I felt the blood rush to my face, a heat that had nothing to do with the Connecticut humidity and everything to do with the absolute isolation I felt in that moment. I looked away from the sneering faces of my peers and sought out my parents, Richard and Diane, who were standing near a stone balustrade sipping sparkling water. My father, a man who built a career on corporate litigation and supposedly valued the truth above all else, simply looked down and began meticulously adjusting his $85 sterling silver cufflinks, refusing to meet my eyes. My mother was even worse. She suddenly became fascinated by a nearby floral arrangement, her fingers tracing the petals of a white peony as if it were the most interesting thing in the world, completely ignoring the fact that her eldest daughter was systematically humiliating her youngest. The silence from the people who were supposed to be my tactical support, my home base, was a deafening roar that confirmed every fear I'd had while staring at the stars in a foreign desert. I realized then that to them, my rank of captain was just a footnote, and my 12 months of sacrifice were merely an inconvenience that didn't fit into the family's polished aesthetic. I was a stranger who happened to share their DNA, a soldier who had forgotten that in this house, perception was the only currency that mattered. Without saying a word, I reached down and slid the IG-certified diamond off my finger, the metal feeling freezing against my skin despite the warmth of the day. I tucked it into a hidden, reinforced pocket of my garment, the small weight of it pressing against my thigh like a secret burden. The cold sting of their indifference settled into my bones, a permanent chill that no amount of summer sun could thaw. I stood back in line, my hands empty and my expression a mask of military discipline, realizing that the family I had spent a year dreaming of returning to didn't actually exist. They were just actors in a high-budget production, and I was the only one who hadn't learned the script. Family isn't blood. Family is who stays when the truth comes out, and as the shutters clicked, I knew I was standing in a room full of strangers. It was nearly midnight when the silence of my childhood home finally began to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a surveillance room. I was sitting alone at the heavy oak breakfast bar in a kitchen that probably cost more than my entire 4-year degree at West Point, lit only by the hum of the Sub-Zero refrigerator and the pale blue light of my phone. In front of me sat a sweating $4 bottle of domestic beer I'd grabbed from a gas station on the way home, a stark contrast to the vintage champagne that had been flowing like water just hours ago at the club. I pulled the ring out of my pocket and placed it on the granite countertop, the 1.8-carat lab-grown diamond catching the dim overhead light and throwing tiny, defiant sparks of white and blue across the surface. It wasn't just jewelry to me, it was the physical manifestation of my dignity, a quiet reminder of every sleepless night and every difficult decision I had made as a commander of soldiers. The quiet was shattered when I opened Instagram and saw the notification at the top of my feed, a new story from Delaney that felt like a deliberate physical blow to my chest. It was a high-resolution photo of her laughing, her head thrown back in manufactured joy while she held a crystal flute of bubbly, but the caption was what truly twisted the knife. At least my sister did not bring her gas station jewelry to the altar, she had written, followed by a series of laughing emojis that felt like mocking echoes in the empty kitchen. I watched the numbers climb in real time, 412 likes and dozens of comments from people we had gone to high school with, people who lived in the same bubble of inherited wealth and unearned arrogance. One person had commented about how military life must have ruined my taste, while another joked about checking the ring for a prize inside a Cracker Jack box. The betrayal was no longer a private family matter. It was a public spectacle choreographed by my own flesh and blood for the entertainment of a digital mob. I looked at the ring again, realizing that while Delaney was busy buying likes and curated moments, she had completely forgotten that I spent the last year managing logistics and intelligence where facts were the only thing that mattered. Love cannot be bought with a $4,000 dress, and respect is not something you inherit along with a trust fund. As I sat there in the dark, the sting of my parents' silence earlier that day began to harden into a cold, tactical resolve. Silence was no longer an option because silence in the face of a lie is just a slow-acting poison. I reached across the counter and grabbed a personalized notepad embossed with my mother's initials, unsheathed a heavy silver Tiffany pen from the holder, and began to write with the clinical precision of a post-mission report. I listed the hard, cold facts that Delaney's vanity couldn't erase. IGI certification number 10293847, the original electronic receipt from Redline Jewelers showing the $3,200 purchase price, and the contact information for my JAG officer who had helped me review the insurance paperwork before I deployed. I wasn't just a bridesmaid she could bully for clout. I was a captain in the United States Army, and I had been trained to identify a threat and neutralize it. My sister wanted to use me as a prop to make herself look richer by comparison, but she had underestimated the person I became while she was busy attending galas. As I finished the list, the weight of the injustice felt lighter, replaced by the familiar clarity of a mission objective. Family is supposed to be the people who stay when the truth comes out, but if the truth was what they feared most, then I was more than happy to be the one to provide it. The war at home was just beginning, and for the first time since I landed back on American soil, I felt like I was back on familiar ground. The next morning at 09:15, The golden, oppressive quiet of Greenwich was replaced by the familiar, sterile atmosphere of the base as I walked into the JAG office. The air here didn't smell like expensive lilies or French perfume. Instead, it was a sharp, grounding mixture of industrial-grade floor cleaner and the scorched scent of stale coffee that had been sitting in a communal pot since dawn. My combat boots, polished to a dull shine that reflected the fluorescent humming lights above, struck the linoleum with a rhythmic precision that felt like a heartbeat returning to its natural pace. I was no longer a prop in a socialite's wedding. I was a captain in the United States Army, and I was moving toward a tactical objective. I was met by Captain Priya Thakur, a sharp-eyed attorney whose reputation for being humorless was legendary across the command. She sat behind a heavy mahogany desk that was cleared of everything except a legal pad and a Montblanc pen, her posture as rigid as a reinforced bunker. I didn't start with emotions or sisterly betrayal. I started with evidence. I laid my phone on the desk, the screen glowing with high-resolution screenshots of Delaney's Instagram story, the 412 likes, and the vitriolic comments from the Greenwich elite. Beside it, I placed the physical IGI certification, document number 10293847, which verified the 1.8-carat lab-grown diamond was a high-quality, $3,200 investment in my own future. Thakur didn't blink as she scrolled through the digital evidence, her fingers tapping a slow, predatory rhythm on the wood of her desk. "This is not just a sibling rivalry, Marin," she said, her voice dropping into a low, professional register that signaled the end of any remaining familial sentiment. "This is documented defamation and targeted harassment of a commissioned officer, especially considering the public nature of her platform and the specific disparagement of your military compensation." She looked up at me, her dark eyes reflecting the harsh overhead lighting, and I saw the same fire there that I had seen in my NCOs during the most difficult days of my deployment. "We don't do jokes here," she added, pulling a stack of official legal letterhead from her drawer. Within 20 minutes, the clicking of her keyboard filled the small office as we drafted a formal cease and desist order. It was a beautiful piece of legal architecture, demanding that Delaney immediately remove all defamatory content, issue a public retraction to the same audience she had misled, and cease all further harassment of my professional character. We specified that the letter would be sent via certified mail with a return receipt requested, ensuring that Delaney would have to sign for her own reality check in front of whatever luxury high-rise doorman happened to be on duty that day. As I watched the printer hum to life, spitting out the pages bearing the official JAG seal, I felt a weight lift off my chest that the $4 beer the night before couldn't touch. This was the first piece of heavy artillery in my counteroffensive, a calculated strike against a woman who thought her $4,500 Vera Wang gown made her untouchable. Delaney had spent years treating my life like a background detail in her own story, but she had forgotten that I was trained to defend my ground against far more dangerous threats than a socialite with a smartphone. I walked out of that office into the bright light of the morning, the certified mail envelope tucked under my arm like a loaded weapon, knowing that for the first time in my life, I wasn't just taking the hit, I was returning fire. At exactly 1400 hours, I stepped out of the humid Connecticut afternoon and into the cool, pressurized silence of Red Line Jewelers, the kind of establishment where the air smells of expensive leather and jewelry cleaner and the front door requires a buzzed entry. I wasn't here to browse the sparkling displays of five-figure necklaces. I was here for the hard data that would dismantle my sister's carefully constructed lie. Mr. Klein, the owner and a man who took pride in the mathematical perfection of his inventory, greeted me with a solemn nod that acknowledged my rank and my history as a client. I didn't need to explain the drama of the Summit Brook Country Club because the look in my eyes told him this was an official inquiry into the integrity of a transaction. He moved behind his heavy glass counter and began tapping on a sleek, brushed aluminum terminal, his fingers dancing across the keys until the digital history of my purchase flickered onto the screen. "Certificate number 99421-B," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of a judge delivering a verdict. He turned the monitor toward me, showing the high-resolution scan of the IGI certification that Delaney had so carelessly dismissed as gas station trash. "Ideal cut, triple excellent grade and VVS1 clarity," he continued, pointing to the microscopic mapping of the diamond that proved it was virtually flawless to the naked eye and even under 10 times magnification. To Delaney the ring was a prop, but to Mr. Klein and the world of high-end gemology, It was a masterpiece of human engineering and ethical sourcing that I had earned with $3,200 of my own salary. He didn't just give me a receipt. He began printing out a detailed dossier, the laser printer humming as it produced page after page of technical specifications, light refraction maps, and a formal appraisal on heavy, textured paper. He slid the documents into a thick, heavy manila folder that felt as substantial as a mission briefing packet. This was my black box evidence, the undeniable record of the truth that would serve as the final nail in the coffin of Delaney's public harassment campaign. I held the folder against my side, feeling the sharp corners through my jacket, and I realized that the dynamic of our entire lives had shifted in the span of an hour. I was no longer the pathetic little sister who had to take the hits and smile for the family photos while my sister mocked my life choices to her 412 followers. I was a captain in the United States Army who had successfully gathered the intelligence, secured the legal backing of a JAG officer, and now held the physical proof of my own worth and my sister's malice. As I walked out of the store and toward my car, a modest but reliable vehicle that stood out among the sea of black 2024 Chevrolet Tahoes in the parking lot, I felt a cold, tactical clarity settle over me. Delaney had spent 34 years believing that she could rewrite reality to suit her vanity, but she had never encountered an opponent who knew how to use the law and the facts as weapons. I had the certification, the Redline Jewelers dossier, and the cease and desist order ready to be deployed. I wasn't just defending a piece of jewelry, I was defending the 12 months of my life I had spent in a desert, the promotion I had bled for, and the dignity that my parents were too cowardly to protect. The engagement was no longer just a social event. It was a theater of operations, and I was the most prepared person in the room. The transition from the girl who took the slap to the woman who returned the fire was complete, and as I turned the ignition, I knew that the next time Delaney opened her mouth to speak about me, she would be hearing from my attorney first. The air in my parents' sprawling suburban home in Greenwich was thick with the forced scent of expensive vanilla candles and the lingering humidity of a Connecticut summer, but inside, the atmosphere was as frigid as a morgue. This was the peace dinner, an exercise in damage control orchestrated by my mother, Diane, who had set the long mahogany table with the good silver and the heirloom Lenox china as if fine dining could wash away the stains of public humiliation. My father, Richard, sat at the head of the table in a charcoal gray Brooks Brothers polo, his expression unreadable, while Delaney arrived late, looking every bit the weary martyr in a $1,500 silk slip dress from Zimmerman. She didn't offer an apology as she slid into her chair. Instead, she reached for the bottle of Malbec, swirling the deep purple liquid in a crystal glass with a practiced, elegant boredom that made my blood run cold. "You are just so exhausting, Marin," she sighed, her voice dripping with a condescending pity that was louder than any shout. "It was just a joke, a bit of light-hearted wedding stress, and you've turned it into this massive, dramatic ordeal like you're still in some desert foxhole." My mother nodded reflexively, her fingers nervously smoothing the white linen napkin in her lap, while my father focused on carving the $60 prime rib roast that sat steaming in the center of the table. I didn't interrupt her, and I didn't raise my voice to match her shrill, artificial tone. I sat perfectly still, my posture reflecting the thousands of hours of military discipline that Delaney could never understand, and I waited for the precise moment of maximum impact. The clinking of silverware against porcelain was the only sound in the room as the main course was served, the rich smell of garlic and rosemary filling the space. I waited until Delaney took a slow, self-satisfied sip of her wine before I reached into my bag and pulled out the heavy manila folder from Redline Jewelers along with a copy of the draft from Captain Thakor. I didn't slide them across the table. I placed them firmly on the placemat in front of me, the white paper stark against the dark wood. "You will be receiving a certified letter from the United States Army JAG office tomorrow morning." "Delaney," I said, my voice calm, level, and carrying the absolute authority of a commanding officer. "It is a formal cease and desist order regarding your documented defamation and harassment of a commissioned officer of the United States Armed Forces." The silence that followed was instantaneous and heavier than the 90-degree heat that had sweltered during the wedding ceremony. Delaney froze, her wine glass hovering inches from her lips, the smirk on her face curdling into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. My mother's hand went to her throat, her eyes darting between us in a panic, while my father finally stopped carving, the silver knife resting uselessly against the roast. "I am done being your punchline," I continued, looking my sister directly in her cold blue eyes until she was the one who had to look away. I have the IGI certification, the purchase records for my $3,200 ring, and a full log of every comment and like on your Instagram story, all of which has been turned over to legal counsel. The room felt like it was losing oxygen as the reality of my counteroffensive sank in. Delaney wasn't dealing with a younger sister who she could bully into submission with a few sharp words and a designer dress. She was dealing with a captain who had the full weight of a legal department and the truth on her side. My parents looked at me as if they were seeing a stranger, perhaps realizing for the first time that the daughter who went away to war wasn't the same one who had returned. As I stood up from the table, leaving my plate untouched, the weight of their collective silence felt like a victory. I had spent a year defending a country that didn't know my name, but tonight I had finally defended myself against the people who should have known it best. The peace dinner was over, and the era of my silence had ended with the sharp final click of my heels on the hardwood floor. Saturday at 10:00 hours arrived with a blistering sun that turned the asphalt of the parade grounds into a shimmering heat trap, but the air was electric with the hum of over 200 people gathered for Family Day. Soldiers in crisp uniforms, children running between static displays of Humvees, and spouses sharing laughter created a landscape of community that was entirely foreign to the cold, transactional halls of the Summit Brook Country Club. I stood near the command tent in my classy uniform, the heavy polyester fabric a familiar weight against my skin, with every piece of brass on my chest polished to a mirror shine that caught the uncompromising morning light. My ribbons were perfectly aligned to the 16th of an inch, a colorful row of evidence documenting my 12 months of service, my leadership, and the sacrifices I had made while my sister was busy attending gallery openings in Arlington. I knew Delaney was coming because she had texted our mother that she wanted to see where I worked, though I knew the truth was far more predatory. She was coming to scout the territory, hoping to find some crack in my professional armor or some low-ranking soldier she could intimidate to make me look small in front of my peers. What Delaney didn't understand was that on this base, I wasn't the ignored younger sister or the girl with the gas station jewelry. I was a captain with the respect of 100 soldiers and the full backing of the Family Readiness Group. I had spent the previous evening coordinating with the FRG lead and my first sergeant, ensuring that the perimeter of my professional life was as secure as a forward operating base. As I saw a black 2024 Chevrolet Tahoe High Country pull into the gravel lot, its pristine paint job looking absurdly out of place among the dust-covered trucks of the enlisted men, I felt a surge of tactical calm wash over me. Delaney stepped out of the vehicle looking like she was headed to a brunch at the Hamptons, wearing a $3,000 white linen suit and oversized Gucci sunglasses that screamed of a world that didn't know the meaning of the word dirt. She walked toward the crowd with a practiced swaying gait, her eyes already darting around for a target, her lips curved into that familiar, condescending smirk she used when she was about to deliver a killing blow to someone's confidence. She didn't see the way the soldiers snapped to attention when I walked by, and she didn't hear the respectful ma'am that followed me like a shadow. She only saw an opportunity to re-establish the hierarchy she had spent 34 years maintaining through psychological warfare and financial bullying. I watched her approach, noticing the way she winced at the smell of diesel fuel and the loud rhythmic thumping of a nearby helicopter's rotors, and I realized that she was a fish out of water in a pond filled with sharks. I had my IGI-certified diamond back on my finger, sparkling with a fierce, laboratory-grown brilliance that defied the sun, a silent sentinel of the fact that I had bought my own status while she was still living on a diet of consulting fees and parental approval. The stage was set, the audience was comprised of the men and women I had bled with, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't worried about what she would say. I had the law in my pocket in the form of the JAG cease and desist, I had the facts in a manila folder in my office, and I had a company of soldiers who saw me as a leader, not a punchline. As she reached the edge of the command tent, her hand already rising to adjust her hair for a photo that would undoubtedly be captioned with some backhanded compliment about my humble surroundings, I stepped forward to meet her. The air was 95 degrees and the humidity was stifling, but as I looked my sister in the eye, I felt as cold and precise as a marksman. This wasn't a family dinner and it wasn't a wedding. This was my territory and I was ready to show Delaney exactly what happens when you try to pull a rank you never earned in a world that only respects the truth. Delaney strutted onto the hot oil-scented asphalt of the motor pool like she was walking a runway at Fashion Week, her $600 Zimmermann silk sundress fluttering in the dry breeze while her oversized Gucci sunglasses masked the predatory glint in her eyes. She moved with a practiced artificial grace that stood in jarring contrast to the rugged utilitarian backdrop of black 2024 Chevrolet Tahoes and olive-drab armored vehicles, her designer sandals clicking sharply against the ground as she scanned the crowd for a stage. She found me standing near a display of M1151 Humvees, where a group of my junior non-commissioned officers were demonstrating equipment to their families, and I could see the moment she decided to strike. She didn't offer a sisterly greeting or acknowledge the solemnity of my uniform. Instead, she arched a perfectly threaded eyebrow and raised her voice just enough to ensure the surrounding soldiers would hear her next words. "Still wearing that fake rock, Captain, or did the Army finally give you a bonus big enough to buy something that didn't come from a vending machine?" Delaney asked, her tone dripping with a saccharine, patronizing pity that was designed to strip me of my authority in front of the very people I led. She stood there with a self-satisfied smirk, expecting the usual retreat, the downward glance, or the quiet plea for her to stop, but she had failed to realize that we were no longer within the protected borders of a Greenwich Country Club. I didn't flinch, and I didn't let the heat of my anger cloud my tactical judgment. Instead, I maintained a locked-in, professional gaze that seemed to catch her off guard. I raised my left hand, letting the 1.8-carat IG-certified diamond catch the 10 a.m. sun, throwing a brilliant, defiant flare of light directly into her expensive lenses. Without breaking eye contact, I gave a sharp, subtle signal to my friend Ava, a fellow officer who was standing 5 paces behind me, holding the heavy manila folder like it contained the launch codes for a strategic strike. Ava stepped forward with a precision that matched my own, her face a mask of professional indifference as she handed me the dossier labeled with the Redline Jewelers insignia. The junior NCOs had gone quiet, sensing the shift in the atmosphere from a casual family visit to a high-stakes engagement, and I could see the first flicker of uncertainty cross Delaney's face as I flipped open the folder. I didn't need to shout to be heard in the sudden silence of the motor pool. "This folder contains the laboratory certification, the $3,200 sales receipt, and a formal appraisal for this ring, which is more authentic than the consulting career you used to justify your lifestyle," I said, my voice carrying with a cold, resonant clarity that silenced the distant hum of the generators. I watched her smirk begin to curdle as I pulled out the draft of the cease and desist order from the JAG office, the official military letterhead visible to everyone standing within a 10-foot radius. "You thought you could come onto this base and use my profession as a punchline for your social media followers, but you forgot that I don't answer to your vanity, I answer to a code of conduct that you couldn't begin to understand." Delaney tried to let out a dry, forced laugh to regain her footing, but it died in her throat when she realized no one was joining her. The soldiers around us weren't looking at me with pity, they were looking at her like she was a security breach that needed to be neutralized. She was a $3,000 dress in a world that valued sweat, blood, and the truth, and for the first time in 34 years, her money couldn't buy her a way out of the facts. I leaned in just enough for her to smell the starch on my uniform and the determination in my breath, my eyes never wavering from hers. "Tomorrow the certified mail arrives at your penthouse in Arlington, and if you ever mention my name or my jewelry on your platform again, the next person you talk to will be a military attorney," I whispered, the finality of my words hitting her harder than any physical blow. I had spent 12 months in a war zone learning how to hold my ground, and as I stood there in the blistering heat of the base, I knew that the pathetic little sister she had tried to invent was officially dead and buried. The midday sun was a relentless weight on the asphalt of the motor pool, but my internal temperature was stone cold as I executed the final phase of my counteroffensive with the clinical detachment of a tactical briefing. I did not raise my voice because a captain who is in control of the battlefield never needs to scream, and the sudden vacuum-like silence that fell over the gathered soldiers and their families was more powerful than any shout could ever be. I reached into the heavy manila folder and pulled out the crisp white sheets of the IGI certification along with the formal JAG notice, the official military letterhead stark and imposing against the olive-drab backdrop of the Humvee displays. My mother and father had just stepped into the perimeter of our conversation, their faces pale under the brim of their expensive sun hats, and I handed each of them a copy of the $3,200 Redline Jewelers receipt and the laboratory dossier without saying a word. I then turned to Delaney, whose $600 silk sundress suddenly looked flimsy and desperate in the presence of actual authority, and I held the primary document up high enough for her small circle of hangers-on and the surrounding junior NCOs to see the bold black ink of the serial number. This diamond is serial numbered and laser etched with a unique identifier that matches the Federal Registry. Delaney, I said, my voice cutting through the humid air with the precision of a scalpel. While you were busy crafting a digital lie for 412 followers, I was documenting the truth of my own achievements and the reality of your targeted harassment. I thrust the JAG cease and desist notice toward her manicured hand, the document detailing her online defamation and the legal consequences of her vanity-driven campaign against a commissioned officer of the United States Army. The atmosphere shifted instantly as a major from the battalion staff, a man who had seen 3 combat tours and didn't tolerate nonsense on his parade deck, slowed his stride and stopped to glance at the official seal on the paperwork I was holding. He didn't say a word, but his sharp, discerning gaze moved from the legal notice to Delaney's stunned, crimson face, and the silent judgment of a superior officer felt like a physical blow to her carefully curated ego. The soldiers whom Delaney had tried to impress with her stories of Greenwich opulence and her snide remarks about gas station jewelry now looked at her with a visceral, unfiltered disgust that no amount of consulting fees could wash away. I heard a muffled whisper from a sergeant standing near the front tire of the M1151, a man who had served with me in the desert and knew exactly what it cost to earn the rank on my chest. "Who talks to their sister like that?" he muttered, the words carrying just far enough to reach Delaney's ears and shatter the last remnants of her socialite armor. My father, Richard, finally looked down at the IGI certification in his hand, his thumb tracing the laser-etched serial number on the page, and for the first time in 34 years he didn't look at Delaney with pride, he looked at her with a profound, quiet shame. My mother was staring at the ground, her fascination with floral arrangements finally replaced by the undeniable reality of the monster she had helped create. Delaney stood there, her Gucci sunglasses slipping down the bridge of her nose as the sweat of the 95-degree heat finally began to ruin her expensive makeup, and I realized that her power had always been an illusion built on the silence of others. By bringing the truth into the light of the motor pool, I hadn't just defended my ring. I had dismantled the hierarchy of the family that had tried to bury my worth under a $4,000 Vera Wang gown. The public execution of her lies was complete, and as I watched her eyes dart around the crowd looking for an escape that didn't exist, I knew she would never be able to look at my hand again without seeing the evidence of her own defeat. I had returned from a war zone to find a different kind of combat, but as I stood my ground in my polished Class A uniform, I was the only one left standing with my dignity intact. Family is not about the blood you share, it is about the respect you earn and the truth you are willing to fight for, and today the truth was the only thing that mattered. The air in the motor pool was thick with the smell of heated rubber and diesel exhaust, but for the first time since my boots hit American soil, I felt like I could finally breathe. Delaney's socialite mask did not just slip. It shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces under the collective gaze of 200 people who valued sacrifice over status. She looked around the circle of soldiers, her eyes darting from my polished jump boots to the hard, unimpressed faces of the NCOs she had tried to use as an audience. And I saw the moment she realized she was no longer at the Summit Brook Country Club. She was in a world where respect is a currency earned through years of service and the weight of a command, not through the curated aesthetic of a 3,000-square-foot penthouse or the cruelty of a snarky Instagram caption. She tried to let out a high, melodic laugh to dismiss the gravity of the JAG notice in her hand, but her voice cracked, turning into a thin, pathetic sound that died against the rhythmic thumping of the nearby helicopter rotors. My parents moved forward then, their faces pale and drawn, sensing the total collapse of the family hierarchy they had spent decades maintaining with their silence. Richard reached out as if to touch my shoulder, and Diane began to murmur something about how we were all making a scene in front of the colonel, but I held up a single, firm hand in a gesture of absolute command that stopped them both in their tracks. "The boundary is set," I said, my voice echoing off the corrugated metal of the maintenance bay with a finality that brooked no argument. "If the Post and every single one of those defamatory comments are not down by 0800 hours on Monday morning, the next letter you receive from the Army JAG office will not be a warning, and it will not be private." I watched as the reality of my words sank in, the threat of a formal legal battle and the potential destruction of her precious public image finally piercing through the armor of her vanity. Delaney looked at me, and for the first time in 34 years, I saw true, unadulterated fear in her eyes instead of the usual condescending pity. She realized that I wasn't the little sister she could manipulate with a designer dress or a backhanded compliment anymore. I was a captain who knew how to identify a threat and neutralize it with surgical precision. Without another word, she turned and fled across the gravel lot, her Jimmy Choo sandals slipping on the loose stones, her posture slumped as she retreated toward her white Lexus SUV. I could see her through the tinted glass, sobbing behind her $400 Gucci sunglasses, a broken queen of a hollow kingdom. My parents stood frozen for a moment, caught between the daughter who had the money and the daughter who had the truth, before they slowly followed her, leaving me standing in the center of my domain. As the dust from her tires settled back onto the Connecticut soil, I looked down at the IGI-certified diamond on my finger, its 1.8 carats catching the blistering sun and throwing a defiant, brilliant spark that no amount of elitism could dim. The soldiers around me began to return to their families, their quiet nods of respect telling me everything I needed to know about who had actually won the engagement. I had spent 12 months in a desert fighting for a country that often felt like a dream, but in this moment I had finally fought for myself. Family isn't about the name on the mailbox or the brand of jewelry you wear. Family is who stands by you when the world gets loud. And as I walked back toward the command tent, I knew I had found my real family among the men and women who wore the same flag on their shoulders that I did. The war at home was over, and for the first time in my life I was the one who had written the peace treaty on my own terms. Monday morning at 07:55 arrived with a quiet pale light that filtered through the modest blinds of my 800-square-foot apartment, casting long geometric shadows across my small wooden dining table. I sat there with a steaming mug of black coffee, the heat radiating through the ceramic and into my palms, as I refreshed my phone one final time to see the digital battlefield finally cleared of its wreckage. The Instagram story that had served as a monument to Delaney's vanity and my supposed inadequacy was gone, deleted into the ether along with the 412 likes and the cruel, snickering comments from the ghosts of our high school past. In its place, sitting at the top of my inbox, was a stiff, clinically forced apology sent from her iCloud account at 3 a.m, a 3-sentence concession that lacked any real warmth but carried the heavy, undeniable weight of a white flag raised in total defeat. It was the sound of a socialite realizing that her $600 sundresses and 3,000-square-foot penthouses were no shield against a JAG cease and desist order and a sister who no longer feared her shadow. The silence of my apartment felt different now. It wasn't the lonely silence of a soldier returning to a hollow home, but the restorative quiet of a commander who had successfully defended her perimeter. I looked down at my hand where the IGI-certified 1.8-carat diamond caught a stray beam of the morning sun, throwing a sharp, brilliant flare against the wall that seemed to mock the memory of the gas station jewelry slur. That ring, which had cost me $3,200 of hard-earned military pay and months of discipline, was no longer a point of contention. It was a trophy of a war won on my own terms. My phone vibrated against the table, a brief, buzzing intrusion that brought a message from my father, Richard. "We should have said something," he wrote, the words appearing on the screen like a late-arriving reinforcement to a battle that had already been decided, followed by a simple, heavy "We are sorry." I stared at the blue bubble of his text for a long moment, my thumb hovering over the glass, but I didn't type a response. An apology offered only after the tactical advantage had been lost and the legal threats had been issued was a hollow thing, a gesture of self-preservation rather than a genuine recognition of the 12 months of sacrifice I had endured while they watched me be humiliated from behind their champagne flutes. I realized then that I didn't need their validation to solidify my rank or my reality. The silence was my answer, a boundary made of reinforced steel that they were no longer permitted to cross without a formal invitation. I stood up, the chair scraping softly against the floor, and began the familiar grounding ritual of preparing for duty, adjusting the collar of my uniform and ensuring my brass was as reflective as the truth I had fought to protect. The clock on the microwave shifted to 0900 hours, signaling the start of my mission and the beginning of a life where my worth was never again up for debate or subject to the whims of a socialite's ego. I am Captain Maren Kepler, a woman who has led soldiers through the dust of a foreign war and through the psychological minefields of a fractured family, and I have emerged from both with my dignity fully intact. As I stepped out of my door and into the crisp morning air, the weight of the manila folder and the sting of the Summit Brook Country Club felt like ancient history, replaced by the steady, rhythmic pace of a woman who knows exactly who she is. Family is not defined by the blood that flows through your veins, but by the loyalty that remains when the lights go down and the cameras stop clicking. I drove toward the base, the sun rising higher in the Connecticut sky, knowing that while Delaney might still have her $4,500 Vera Wang gowns, I had something far more permanent. I had the respect of my peers, the power of my own truth, and a future that no one else was allowed to write.